complete success for Russia would be no ceasefire and the war continues because they're slowly winning the war. They're grinding the Ukrainians down. Complete success for the Americans, for Donald Trump, would be to walk out today and announce, I have brokered a ceasefire, the war has ended. I don't think either of those two, they're at the extreme ends of the ambit spectrum. I think more likely will be that Donald Trump will strong-arm Vladimir Putin and say, you must meet Volodymyr Zelensky. Putin doesn't want to meet Zelensky. He doesn't think Zelensky's on a level footing with him. He thinks he's way above Zelensky. In fact, he says Ukraine's not a real country anyway, so why would you want to meet the leader of a fake country? Donald Trump's challenge right now, sitting here not far away from where I am, is to convince Putin, you must have that meeting with Zelensky, and I want to be there, and if you don't, you're going to be hit with some of the toughest sanctions you've ever seen. I think that's the playbook. Certainly from what Donald Trump's been saying in the last few days and weeks, that's the approach that Donald Trump's probably taking at this very moment. Certainly so far the optics, the impressions are positive. There was a real warmth there. It was interesting. They both walked off their planes simultaneously. Donald Trump walked along the red carpet and got to the point where the two of them were meeting about 20 seconds before Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump then, in his sort of individual style, the way he often does those little claps, he clapped 3 times on 3 separate occasions as Vladimir Putin walked towards him. They then shook hands. They then, and this was quite an extraordinary image, they then got into Donald Trump's official presidential car, the so-called Beast, and I can't remember ever seeing a foreign leader in the back of that car. It's considered one of the single most secure places that a president has, for obvious reasons, you know, the bulletproof windows and everything. So the pictures of Vladimir Putin sitting in the back of that US presidential car, and clearly you could see Vladimir Putin was laughing. They were obviously having some sort of joke. So they're now, right at this moment, they've gone into the meetings here in Anchorage. Each of them has taken 2 other advisors, which is interesting. It was going to be a 1-on-1. It's now a 3-on-3. So they're meeting at this very moment.
Yeah, so certainly already some of those protocols thrown out the window. We're just seeing the images of the so-called Beast, the presidential motorcade there. In terms of, after all that pomp and ceremony, John, what can we actually expect from this meeting today? We understand it could be up to 6 or 7 hours of these talks.
Well, both presidents are planning to leave Anchorage tonight. Neither of them is staying here overnight. And so it's interesting, Donald Trump made a reference on the way here that Vladimir Putin was bringing quite a big delegation of business advisors. One of the people who has arrived here with this Russian leader is Kirill Dmitriev, who is head of the sort of, if you like, Putin's sort of money, the sovereign wealth fund in Russia, and he's very much a businessman. And so it looks like the Russians are wanting this to be an opportunity as to what we can do with critical minerals and trade. But as Donald Trump has said, there will be none of that. There will be no trade, he says, until this war is resolved. What I think will come out of this is, I think, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in coming hours will make a joint statement, a press conference, and my sense from talking to people here is that they will announce a follow-up meeting which will then include the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky.
And you mentioned a moment ago, John, that the plans for that one-on-one meeting between the two presidents wasn't happening, other people coming into the room. What have you been able to glean about the change, that last-minute change to the schedule?
Well, that's a fascinating situation, Dan, because Donald Trump was happy to have a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. In fact, in the past, he has reveled in that. And in fact, when it's just been the two of them and their 2 translators, and there have been meetings they've had in the past, one at least, where in fact at the end of it, Donald Trump said to the 2 translators, "Give me your notes." And he literally grabbed the notes off the translators. He didn't want any record of what they'd been talking about. And he likes that one-on-one. He seems to have an intriguing special bond with Vladimir Putin. Nobody quite understands why they have this special bond. But what appears to have happened is the Europeans and the Ukrainians beseeched Donald Trump not to have a one-on-one because they know how persuasive Vladimir Putin is. You don't get to be a senior KGB officer like Putin was. He's a master in subterfuge, in recruiting people for the KGB, in their psychological profiles. And he's seen off about 5 US presidents. And Donald Trump himself said the other day, Vladimir Putin has fooled many US presidents, he's not going to fool me. And it looks like the Europeans and the Ukrainians said to Donald Trump, please have other people in there as witnesses, so Vladimir Putin can't later on verbal you and say you agreed to this and that. So we have Marco Rubio's in the room, the Secretary of State, and Steve Witkoff, one of Donald Trump's closest friends. They were in New York real estate together. That's one of the closest bonds that Donald Trump has. He's also National Security Advisor. So the Americans have 3 and the Russians have 3.